I want to start with acknowledging that we are today meeting on the lands of the Orange people of the Cowen Nation, a place where they lived, take care of the land, and which we now refer to as Melbourne. I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to their history of resilience, survival, and courage. And I hope, as I mentioned initially, that this formality would one day find a greater expression in this nation's future, becoming a country that is truly reconciled with itself and that is capable of shaping a future that redeems the past. Secondly, I am very grateful to have here members of the Victoria University, including the Vice Chancellor, Adam Shoemaker, also Andy Hill, and all the other wonderful people whose names I've forgotten, so I'll attempt not to go through the list. Finally, and before I invite Adam to say some words, I wanted to also share some remarks about John Faine, who is too famous to be introduced, so I'll avoid reading any biography. But I thought perhaps I might share an anecdote, which sometimes can tell more about a person than what might be publicly available. I think I met John Faine, like most of you. Actually, maybe I should correct myself and say I heard John Faine before I met him. And the first time I think I met him was an invitation to the ABC, the Conversation Hour. I had attempted at the time to convince him of the poetry of rap music, and he's just recently informed me that he's still not convinced. However, when I was invited to go to the Conversation Hour, I remember thinking he had probably made a mistake, because I think hearing John Faine, I was quite impressed by his ability to tackle public issues with such intellectual rigor, as well as maintaining a form of moral clarity that can be very, very hard to sustain when you're talking about things that matter. I personally took that as a vote of confidence in that I might be able to at least think 2 steps closer to where you are. And for a person who at the time was trying to find my voice, find my confidence, and find self-confidence, that was a really great moment for me. It allowed me to at least think about the possibility of what can happen if you could live up even to a small measure of that. So for me personally, thank you for that gift, and I know I've never really mentioned it, but every time I have been in public spaces where you were involved, more recently on Q&A, your presence there always gave me a sense of belonging. In a fundamental way, a sense of I can actually fail and I'll be okay. And I am so grateful for that. And it might not be a very great anecdote in your very impressive bio, but it is a very important part of who I think I hope to become, and maybe I am. So thank you so much for that, and I now welcome Adam Shoemaker to do the introduction.
Well, colleagues, I just think that was incredibly moving and truthful. And it is the case that as we acknowledge and remember, where we are tonight and the space and time, it isn't just First Nations knowledge, but it is knowledge, full stop, that we're talking about here. And First Nations knowledge is one way in to knowledge, full stop. It's not the only way in, but it is so important. And we've had more than a year and a half, 2 years of not listening to various voices, and they're still not all being heard. And I think it's wonderful as we hear each other's voices tonight to actually remind ourselves that it is part of the future for Australia to listen deeply, carefully, and resoundingly. And that's why we're here. And I thank you for what you've just said, because to me, that isn't just personal, that's political as well, in the best sense of the word. Thank you, Niadal. Hear, hear. Now, I don't want to just echo, because people use that word echo a lot at the beginning of speeches, as if it's just a chamber. It's not. It's actually to reverberate in really meaningful ways that things have to happen. And we're here for the 8th Sir Zelman Cowen Centre Oration, okay, which is a very special event in our calendar. It comes around each year. We look forward to it immensely, because people don't just speak. They speak boldly and brightly and fervently about issues of moment and matter. And we listen to each other in that way. And this year's oration, as you know, with John Faine, is going to be focusing on an especially timely, can we not imagine a more timely issue, how social media influences the health of our democracy. So people have used lots of phrases to describe the invention of social media, whether it's anti-social media or antithetical media, anti-humanist media, anti-humane, all sorts of terms. But what is actually going on is a very, very big question, and it's one to concern all of us, I believe. And with your experience, John, as a journalist, as a lawyer, as a broadcaster, as a thinker, as a person who's also got a role at the University of Melbourne, which we really endorse strongly, you bring a wealth of insight into that critical debate, because it is a debate, and it has to be had. Examining not just online interactions, but do they advance or undermine meaningful civic engagement? And I'm really here to listen and to learn from you, and I think it's a wonderful thing. Every time I used to be involved in some of the public events that John would cover, he did the best preparation of any journalist I've ever worked with. And you could just tell from the quality of questioning that you put forward. So I want to thank you in advance for what you're about to say. It's just great. And at Victoria University, we're really proud, and we're super proud of you, Nadal. We're super proud of all the people in the centre, and of course, the history of Sir Zelman Cowen that we honour each year, but every other day of the year as well. And I want to recognise members of the family who are here with us. Thank you very much for your support. It's fantastic having you with us. It is the case that analysing and navigating the complexities of modern communication is a tall order, and we're up for it. And it's with great pleasure, therefore, that tonight, I'm not just introducing John Faine AM, I'm introducing the topic. And I believe it's one that we all should pay very close attention to, not just in terms of where we are in Melbourne or Victoria or Australia, but the world. And John has not only been a fixture in Australia's public conversation, but also a passionate advocate for human rights, and that's no better thing. Currently, as I said before, a Vice Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne, his expertise spans law, media, social justice, the world, and solutions. And he's the author of a recent book, Apollo and Thelma, which delves into extraordinary Australian stories, of which his is undoubtedly one. John, I cannot wait to hear what you're going to say. I welcome you to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you both for your very generous words. I too pay my respect for the Indigenous people whose land, never ceded, we meet upon, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And as well as the normal recital, I add my regret at the outcome of the Voice referendum, which to me was such a small step for this young nation to start the path to truth-telling and reconciliation, without which we are forever diminished. Indeed, it was the failure of the Voice referendum after a remarkably effective but shallow and dismissive campaign from those arguing against such a modest proposition. It was that failure that exposed a civics deficit, a yawning chasm in the understanding Australians have about how this joint is run. And that civics deficit is what triggered the invitation and the topic for this oration. The bumper sticker slogan, "If you don't know, vote no," gained traction because so many Australians know next to nothing about the machinery of our government. That the Australian electorate was so vulnerable to a misleading and willfully ignorant message tells us what about our country, and what do we do about it? So, can democracy survive the kaleidoscope of social media? Spoiler alert, yes. But there's a few things we have to attend to along the way. And yet I'll say thank you very much for the invitation, a most welcome opportunity to approach that inherently dangerous device, the microphone. I've not been suffering from relevance deprivation, nor withdrawal symptoms, But if I did, it would hardly be a surprise for someone who for so long made a living as a self-important failed shock jock. So Zelman Cowen had about as distinguished a career in the law and public affairs as anyone could have. At the highest possible levels, he achieved distinction after distinction. And I think we owe a special debt of gratitude that his tenure as Governor-General restored public faith in that office after the somewhat tenuous connection to respectability of his predecessor, Sir John Kerr. I interviewed Sir Zelman when his memoir, A Public Life, was published nearly 20 years ago. We were both lawyers. We both traced our heritage and roots to what is now Belarus. Both of our families had found sanctuary in this new world on the opposite side of the globe from that which they fled. But there the similarities come crashing down. I scraped through my law degree, spending as little time as possible in class, instead chasing distinction at billiards, throwing frisbees, and certain other student activities that are best not specified in detail in public. In the studio, Sir Zelman was, as always, modest, meticulous, gracious and thoughtful, and with an astonishing capacity for remembering detail, matched to an appreciation of how he had played his part in history. His preparedness to subject himself to the indignity of an ABC radio interview was in part moderated by an enduring friendship he and Lady Cowen had had with my late parents. And I also had the pleasure of hosting the remarkable Lady Anna Cowen in the studio when her memoir, A Vice-Regal Life, was released in July 2017. Former Police Commissioner Christine Nixon was my co-host that day, and another guest was the remarkable philanthropist Jeannie Pratt. And she and Lady Anna compared the experience of being surviving, supportive spouses of a larger-than-life partner. But enough name-dropping. This invitation presents an opportunity to explore a vexing problem in our technically advanced and prosperous community and an ongoing urgent tussle being played out all around the globe, not just the rich world or the Anglosphere. Everywhere, north and south, rich and poor nations, people are trying to work out how to distill the good bits of the new digital era whilst minimising, if not altogether discarding, the bad bits. This is not a novel tussle. And those of us in the room with grey hair, we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. It mirrors what's happened time and time again with the incandescent light bulb, steam-driven railways, printing presses, the telegraph, internal combustion engines, and when mass-produced film cameras first arrived, to name a few. Anyone remember cassettes, cartridges, Blu-ray? Technology is endlessly evolving, and with it come the attendant challenges of making sure that society can manage not just the technical, but also the social, economic, and legal impacts. In ancient times, I suspect there would have been some argument about the benefit of the wheel when it was first used to shift a carcass of a woolly mammoth to the safety of a cave. There's always a tussle when society-changing technology first arrives, and there's always a lag between its commercial adoption and the need for guardrails, some regulation to avoid unintended and often unforeseen harm. It took around 10 years for road rules, licensing, registration and insurance to develop after Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz attached a single-cylinder two-stroke motor to a cart and marvelled that they'd invented a self-propelling horseless carriage. But if you'd asked the good burghers of Mannheim what they wanted, they would have asked for faster horses instead of cars, trucks or buses. Remember that for the first few years, someone had to walk in front of the newfangled, noisy, smelly machines with a white flag to avoid spooking the neighbourhood nags. Now, I confess I have a weakness for old cars. I hoped I could speak tonight about the evolution of French sports cars between the wars, but for some unfathomable reason, Yadal insisted on something to do with law and democracy. I readily agreed, But it would have been totally crazy to allow, say, Henry Ford to draft the road rules. He actively campaigned against governments imposing limitations on the adoption of the newfangled automobile. It'll just inhibit the social utility of the fabulous gadgets, he would have argued, which is exactly what the tech moguls today say as they lobby against their products being regulated. It's hardly surprising that billionaires don't want anything to interfere with their amassing of the most extravagant fortunes and concentration of wealth and power that capitalism has ever seen. Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos and their cadre ought to be the very people we do not listen to when working out how to rein in and regulate Musk, Zuckerberg and Bezos. But we do keep listening to the modern day robber barons who made their fortunes from not being regulated. And they loudly predict, penny-like, that everything will turn to mush if some impertinent tin pot parliamentarian somewhere tries to get in their way. Protecting society from the excesses of social media is now matched with greater urgency with the perils that accompany the fast accelerating rollout of artificial intelligence, as if we weren't grappling with enough change already. And there are some self-styled e-commerce experts, not all of whom, it must be said, are on the payroll of the tech giants. Some of these experts prefer the viewpoint that there is nothing to see here. It's just the typical teething troubles with any new tech. Stop being alarmist, move along, or better still, just get out of the way. Other, more anxious and even technophobic types call for the opposite. They want an innovation pause, a moratorium, globally, on the adoption of any new tech until the settings are in place. Each, in my opinion, is equally silly. It would just mean that the good global citizens sit on their hands while the bad actors forge ahead. And since this version of technology poses nothing less than an existential threat to democracy itself, letting despots and dictators get a head start would be a disaster. Instead, we need to better study and understand the magnitude of the problem and with some urgency find solutions that on the one hand protect innovation, whilst on the other safeguarding the human element, particularly for those most vulnerable people who, as always, would be the ones who bear the brunt of techno overreach. Now, since ministerial staff and policy advisors seem to my myopic eyes to be recruited direct from creche these days, I worry that even though they're digital natives, they might not be capable of the technical and creative sophistication involved in finding solutions. Indeed, we may end up taking advice from kids who are only artificially intelligent. When the chips are down, had to get that in, we all have to understand the social media and AI challenge is compromised if we do not take history and human nature into account, not just the hardware and the software. It's long ago become abundantly clear that social media platforms are now the main source of information of all kinds, vital or trivial, for not just younger citizens, but even middle-aged or just plain old baby boomers and everyone in between. It's estimated that 72% of the global population now get their news delivered online. The information monopoly is even more critical an issue than the admittedly serious problem of the digital divide, which is what happens to people for whom a tech solution is never going to work. Those who, for whatever reason, education, language, disability, poverty, cannot or will not embrace illiteracy, and thus these days are simply excluded from so much of society because things only happen online. How many in this room read an actual newspaper today? A surprising number of hands. Something printed onto paper last night before being trucked to a warehouse to be eventually tossed over your front fence in the wee hours by some kid wobbling past on a bicycle. Well, most people, if they read any news today, it's much more likely to be something that flashes past on a screen of a mobile phone or a tablet. Indeed, anybody under 35 will most likely not have looked at what is now patronisingly dismissed as legacy media. That is, content prepared in a commercial or publicly funded television, radio or print newsroom, where a curated collection of carefully moderated, fact-checked and verified reports are assembled by professional journalists trained to sift bull from dust. I'm referring to that quaint anachronism of organisations that subscribe to and to some extent or other enforce ethical standards and have established a media code requiring ethical practice. Qualified and trained journalists are at risk of becoming as irrelevant and as much of an anachronism as typewriter mechanics. Many of you will have found out whatever it is that you know about our world from a social media feed, a push notification from a subscription service, or a TikTok or Instagram video by that strange new creature called an influencer. Now, the best thing to say about anyone self-describing as an influencer is that they almost certainly are no such thing. Instead, some boorish non-entity living in a fantasy world populated by imaginary friends and followers, but trying to trick us into treating them as celebrities. As the famed and wildly successful American showman P.T. Barnum explained, there's a sucker born every minute. TikTok influencers have no training, no qualifications, don't defer to scientific or other expertise, have no understanding of nuance or context, don't verify facts before pronouncing them as true, display little or no appreciation of the desirability of balance, of emotional disengagement, or the difference between activism and reportage in delivering whatever they think is lucrative or pertinent, as often as not, seeded by an undisclosed sponsor or underwriter. On reflection, that sounds a lot like the qualifications of a commercial radio presenter or a columnist in the Murdoch tabloids. You may already know, but it's worth reminding ourselves that anybody can buy followers and friends from online factories where hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of followers and likes can be manufactured for a fee, artificially inflating the supposed relevance and currency of anyone who's sufficiently cashed up and determined to curate a public image. Now, there has been for a long time some version of this. Publicists can and always could be hired to create the perception of power or influence, to convert a nobody into a somebody. But now it can be done with just a few clicks of a mouse or the swipe of a screen. Although it must be conceded by even someone as professionally sceptical as me that for every 1,000 wannabes, so-called influencers, there might be someone who actually does occasionally shift the dial. For the rest, well, I've got a snake that needs oiling. Back to the legacy media model. It's collapsing in front of our eyes. Print and free-to-air television empires are racking up huge losses. Shareholder value is evaporating, fortunes are disappearing, staff are being shed, corners being cut, and worst of all, content is being squeezed in quantity and quality. The attention has shifted to the influencers. You may have noticed the desperation of the mainstream media survivors, leading to a veritable deluge of ads from businesses that, in a more discerning and confident past, would never have been put into bed with these once respectable outlets. This explains the dangerous and ugly infection of our sporting codes and the sometimes wall-to-wall coverage by endless obnoxious gambling ads. Laughingly, robotically back-announced, with meaningless platitudes about the harm they know they cause. Also, there's the conversion of once significant and weighty broadsheet newspapers into little more than glorified junk mail catalogues, peppered with just enough editorial content to keep us turning the pages in the search for some original reportage about something we maybe already didn't know. It's a tragic downward spiral. Smaller audiences mean less money, means less original content, which leads to smaller audiences, and on it goes. To counter the inevitable charge that will be directed at me that I'm just some smug, self-righteous relic, guilty of exaggerating the glories of media past, let's acknowledge the brutal reality of how diverse our media is and dispel any romantic notion that until new media came along, everything was fine and dandy with the old. Far from it. Much of what is sometimes vigorously defended about the old media was muckraking rubbish. Just like a lot of what's on new media is muckraking rubbish. Supermarket giveaways and trashy tabloids would give us a first-hand account of someone kidnapped by a UFO. Always in Nevada for some reason. Anyone know why? Or some fictional royal marriage bust-up, or more brats born to some obscure inbred duke, dame or earl. Now, not that I care if another regal parasite here or there arrives, they never interested me. After all, their claim to be special rests on inherited privilege and apparently royal blood. Spare me, what nonsense. But back to trash news. My eternal favourite was always the Loch Ness Monster. Hooray for Nessie. But light-hearted, seditious and treasonous digs aside, there are serious consequences arising from the collapse of the old media. While we cannot resist and ought not desist from making fun of the media's failings, there are profound connections between the crisis besetting our third estate and the future of democratic institutions. More journalism graduates now work in spin doctoring than reporting. The AFL and its member clubs employ more actual journalists than those working in independent sport media. The media unit at our police headquarters dwarfs some of the newsrooms to which they feed a reliable diet of stories presented with one eye on the next state budget and the other on fuelling a breathless, endless, lopsided law and order debate. The federal and state governments and PR companies now employ most of the graduates from journalism courses at our universities. And the fresh hacks are put to work churning out press releases, organising stunts and media opportunities to glorify every donning of a hard hat or high-vis vest by the minister for this, that or the other. Their daily grind is to produce government talking points to present to the grateful, time-poor reporters they used to sit next to in journalism class, who, when sent to cover a government announcement, our platform-agnostic cross-media content creators, who used to be called journalists, are somehow supposed to listen to the minister, ask questions, then file for live news crosses to radio and TV, post to social media, prepare and film a report with a piece to camera for the evening news, and throw together 300 words for the website. Whereupon they catch a crowded tram back to the office because the budget for cab charges was blown halfway through the financial year. And to make it even more humbling, they earn a fraction of what's being paid to the PR flack or government hack they just encountered. Or maybe that's just the ABC journos who are there. So it's not surprising that any spin-doctored pre-digestion of the issues is gratefully accepted, to the point where Media Watch on ABC TV will regularly offer up a gotcha moment, greeted by most people in the working journalism as "there but for the grace of God go I." With the diminution of quality and capacity of content from the traditional news outlets, it's hardly surprising there's a consequential decline in the audiences as they drift off to other methods of finding out stuff, which leaves the media survivors fighting over those who, in social media terms, provide the most valuable commodity of all: engagement. Passive viewers, listeners or readers are not valued as much as those who engage with content, which means commenting, liking, sharing, or responding in some way. That's who's treasured and relentlessly pursued, because they might follow a hyperlink to an ad and make a purchase. Gold. Thus, a story that triggers a strong response, engagement, will be allocated resources and given priority over something important but worthy and dull. Vertical fiscal imbalance will never outrate a weight loss shortcut or a stabbing or shooting. If it bleeds, it leads. Now, engagement with media is akin to civic engagement. A citizen who volunteers at Meals on Wheels or the local neighbourhood house literacy program is undoubtedly more connected than someone who just pays their rates and does no more. As old media invests less and less in covering and explaining the news, the quality of the coverage declines, people stop consuming the content, we have disengagement. Fewer people digesting news gradually leads to knowing less and then to taking less interest in how the place is run. If we don't maintain the machinery of democracy, like any machine, it will break. In the last few years, there's been a spectacular drop-off in voter turnout in elections in lots of countries, many of them like ours. A trend of lower participation. New Zealand, an election last year, 77% participation, compared to the mid-80% in elections until then. UK, voter turnout in this year's election, the second lowest in a century, under 60%. The USA, Trump-Biden, 2020, a contest that Trump lost. Yes, he lost. Of voters 45 and older, only 70% participation. Under 30 years, 54% participation. It's well documented that younger voters are overwhelmingly likely to vote Democrat. So the result in just a few weeks' time may well swing on whether Kamala can get young people to vote. This is the generation that gets their news and whatever passes as analysis of politics from TikTok, which is why I was somewhat reassured to see the Harris campaign get Taylor Swift on their team, and why Vice President Harris appeared last week with 20-something-year-old Alex Cooper, who has 5 million listeners to her podcast, Call Her Daddy, the second most popular podcast on Spotify. There's an example of an influencer who does have influence. Now, tempting as it is, we tend to snicker at TikTok, but we do it at our peril. Harris has risen to the challenge to try to harness a youth-friendly platform to her campaign and convert it to being a resource rather than sneer at it. After all, she has to. Her adversary lives his entire life as if it's a TikTok video. His entire existence is performative. Smartphones might not, after all, be making us dumber, but they are undoubtedly making us more narcissistic and perpetually theatrical. There's always a camera on us, so we behave as if we're on stage. People fall off cliffs taking selfies, I remind you. But let's not start going down the Trump rabbit hole. I'll probably lose my marbles. They eat the dogs, they eat the cats. We will find out in this election whether getting attention is the same as getting votes. Everything will depend on that, and politics for years will follow whichever way it goes. The most recent election in Japan, 2021, only 30% of citizens in their 20s voted. Voters in their 60s, 70% turnout. Japanese teenagers, less than half of them believe society can be changed by their actions. Now, interestingly, France, the voter turnout in 2024 went against trend. They had a higher voter turnout as the unified anti-Marine Le Pen groups mobilised to block her campaign. So it can happen. But our most recent experience in Australia, the Voice referendum, delivered confusing results too. Overall voter turnout was 90%. But let's dig a little deeper. Social media for the Yes case had more views than the No campaign, but that failed to carry the day. The Yes campaign on YouTube carried 75 videos, viewed collectively nearly 20 million times. The much smaller number of offerings by the No campaign were viewed far fewer times, which suggests that negative messages about division were more effective than positive messages about the benefits of the Voice. Sky News, which is little more than an assembly line for YouTube content for the US conspiracy theory marketplace, which I might mention is lucrative beyond any revenue that they generate within Australia. Sky News effectively is paid for by people in America watching their clips. They produced 400 videos on The Voice, which had 19 million views. Clearly, many of those people were not in Australia. And hilariously, the No camp, throughout the campaign, complained long and loud about the vote being rigged and the AEC, the Electoral Commission, being biased, until the No vote succeeded, whereupon they changed their tune very rapidly and somewhat. So what does all this mean? In an era where our main political parties now have fewer members than mildly successful football clubs, my worry is that the evidence shows young people, together with growing sections of the older population, don't bother voting, not just here but around the world, because it does not deliver for them. The more unequal we are, the more likely we are to see this fragmentation and polarisation. The best functioning democracies, after all, those in the world that are those in the world that are most equal economically. That was the work of Thomas Piketty, the Nobel Prize-winning French economist, whose book lots of us bought but nobody read. Well, it's really thick. It's really hard. Millennials and Gen Zers, known as Zoomers, are the first generation since the Depression who will be less prosperous than their parents. So it's not surprising if they're less invested in the outcome of an election. No matter which way it goes, it hardly seems to make a difference to their daily life. They feel no sense of ownership, no obligation. They're not invested in the system, which not only doesn't work for them, but seems to work actively against them. So if we want democracy to work and to survive, it has to mean something to everyone, not just older people or the prosperous or the knowledge class. We're fighting an information war. And in any war, as Aeschylus, the creator of the Greek tragedy, said, in war, truth is the first casualty. Although Americans claim it was a Californian Republican Senator, Hiram Johnson, who said it 2,500 years later, but either way. In an information war, misinformation and disinformation is even more central to the struggle. And disinformation is just misinformation with the intent to deceive added in. So that's mis versus disinformation. Now, you've probably never heard of spamouflage, Dragon Bridge, CapCut, or Storm 1376. According to the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team, these are Chinese state-sponsored creators of fake videos that were used to try to sway the outcome of the 2024 Taiwan election. Deepfake newsreaders, generated by AI, appeared on popular social media platforms reading totally fictitious negative news reports about the outgoing president, and directing viewers to Communist China-friendly candidates' websites instead. According to the report in The Economist on May the 4th, 2024, some of these videos were being shared 100 times a minute before they were taken down. This was not the first and most certainly will not be the last time that democratic processes will be stress tested by rival states trying through technology to undermine what they cannot achieve by force or in a fair and open election. Russian disinformation against Ukraine has persisted from the earliest days of that bloody and distressing conflict. In September 2023, a totally fake news report about Ukraine President Zelensky's wife, Olena, claimed a staff member from Cartier, the jewellery shop in New York, had served her when she bought $1 million worth of jewels. The story quietly circulated to no great effect until it was amplified through some privately owned African news sites, then put onto X, and then went viral, using what's called a seeder account, which I'll explain in a moment. Small problem with the story. Mrs. Zelensky wasn't in New York, she was in Canada on the day that the completely fake Cartier staffer claimed to have sold her the jewellery, and Mrs. Zelensky had never visited Cartier, nor had she bought jewels anywhere else. Russian meddling in the Brexit process has been widely documented and litigated, and of course Cambridge Analytica's meddling for Brexit and Trump has been thoroughly ventilated. So swarm technology and seeder accounts allow the rapid deployment of mis and disinformation through bots, robots, autonomous social media accounts, using algorithms programmed to slide unnoticed into your social media feed. Here's how it works. You might be getting messages on X or Facebook or Instagram or whatever other platform about your favourite football club, or you may be tempted to click on a new recipe, or for certain demographics, a scantily clad bikini model. What is happening is you are being tempted to subscribe or follow to what is called a seeder account, a feed that then morphs from harmless to malicious content at the click of a button. Large numbers of subscribers are collected to watch funny or otherwise benign content, but once a critical mass of followers is collected, the creator on-sells the site and its data, your digital address, your identity. And the subscribers are then handed over to bad actors who can start peppering you with disinformation. So that gossip about Kate Middleton, or whatever the other one's name is, may not be about the latest royal tiff at all. It's scooping up subscribers to eventually on-sell your digital identity to someone else, who will then start to send you advertising or maybe heavily disguised political messages about the perils of immigration or why the world needs more coal. Now, most of us don't want to become online detectives as we scroll through our feeds. We don't have alarms ringing about all the traps online, such as bots that create multiple posts about the same thing, or requests to follow someone who only started their account last week and has 2 followers. We don't want to have to look under the bonnet to see whether someone is real or fake. We're not accustomed to treating people suspiciously by default in any other part of our lives, and we don't want to start doing it in the digital world either. And why should we? Surely it's the people who run these businesses, the platform operators, the biggest, richest companies in the world who ought to be ensuring that their marketplace, which they dominate, is well run. Let's adapt consumer protection models. Instead of individualising responsibility, making the end user the person responsible, the person who's supposed to carry the weight of checking the bona fides of the supplier. We don't make every car buyer responsible for sorting out defects in new cars. nor is it up to us to test food when we buy it. We know we can buy with confidence because there are regulations and checks in place to ensure what's sold is safe. These rules save each and every one of us from having to be the equivalent of the government regulator, someone invested with the power by the state to compel a product recall if the brakes don't work on a new car or a batch of salami has gone off. Likewise, it ought not be up to every user of social media to try to be their own regulator. To individualise responsibility is a dereliction of the rules of good governance, and it leaves those who are tech savvy safer than those who are not. It's delegating the responsibility of the state for collective well-being to the individual, and as well as being inherently unfair, it is also economically inefficient. The only people who think it's a good idea are the providers. So how does this connect to sustaining democracy? Well, it boils down to the civics deficit again. And in an era of short attention spans, we must be ever vigilant. If you ask your average punter do they know what's meant by the rule of law or to explain the separation of powers, most will look at you with a squint and think that you're talking about a review of the absurdly arbitrary umpiring cruelling the prospects of their footy team. Most citizens in this country have no idea of the name of more than one or two politicians, quite likely don't know who's in power, which party stands for what principles, and whether the police are run by the state or federal government. They do know that local governments are responsible for roads, rates and rubbish, but after that's a bit of a blur. The workings of the state, by and large, remain not just a mystery but an irrelevance until that ritual comes around of queuing for our democracy sausage. Compulsory voting is one of Australia's more profound contributions, I might say, to the world, along with freestyle swimming. Remember, it was called the Australian crawl. Oh, and we should include Rupert Murdoch too. The trust deficit, a decline in trust in democracy, is happening in parallel with the trust crisis for churches, media, police, science, judges and politicians. Research commissioned by the McKell Institute by Cos Samaras and Tony Barry from Redbridge shows an across-the-board collapse in trust, which they say explains the rise of independents in our parliaments, and particularly the Teals, who are thought to be more likely to speak sincerely and authentically. It's about building a relationship, an enduring relationship, between the governors and the governed. I love quoting John Howard. Why are people laughing? A great political thinker. You can't fatten a pig on market day, was one of his favourite sayings. You build and build and build a relationship for when you need it. There are so many examples where trust has broken down because of the failure of government. Robo-debt, veterans' mental health and suicide, war crimes allegations that after 8 years has still seen no charges looking like anywhere near being laid. Here in Victoria, Nicola Gobbo and VicPol, despite an extraordinary Royal Commission, nobody has in any way been held to account for clearly what was a system, not just a few rogue officers. And then this week, an extraordinary disclosure that Victorian Police Officer Detective Sergeant Wayne Dean, after 3 years investigation and was being suspended for arresting and interviewing people to help a mate who was a debt collector who was paying him to do a bit of work on the side, that after a 3-year investigation and 2 years on paid leave, he resigned without having at any point been punished. This leads to grievance culture. It stems from people who don't just feel but actually are missing out. And that's lots of us. And those people, those of us, we're more likely to be susceptible to simplistic answers to complex problems. I was at an event with John Brumby this week where he said when he joined the Parliament, former Victorian Premier, when he joined the Parliament, someone came up to him and said, just remember, For every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's always wrong. The rise and the peril of social media is a global problem. Waiting for a global solution would be disastrous, and bold leaders can make a difference. Look at what happened after the Christchurch mosque massacre. Even as small a global player as New Zealand, but with a determined leader, Jacinda Ardern, could take a stand and succeeded in dragging other nations along, accelerating the global acceptance of the need for a different approach and forcing change. We can't wait for another massacre. After the UK riots in August this year, and mobs were mobilised through social media, the state's response was not just expediting prosecutions and incarcerating perpetrators and organisers, but they also immediately ordered a review of their Online Safety Act, which had demonstrably failed. That law empowers the UK media regulator to fine social media platforms that fail to tackle misinformation, which is pretty useless after the event. A lie goes around the world before the truth has got out of bed, is an old saying. It'll be interesting to see how much that review's impact will have, because Elon Musk, on his own platform, X, that used to be called Twitter, told his 193 million followers at the time of the UK riots, civil war is inevitable, which in his hands seems as much a threat as an observation. The distribution of the call to riot was quickly traced to a series of foreign-based troll factories dispersed from North Korea to the former Soviet republics and other hard-to-reach jurisdictions. During the regulatory e-debrief, the biggest trolls were found to be based in offshore digital havens and unreachable to the UK authorities. But what is worst is that you can make money starting a riot. X has a revenue sharing model, which means if you post content that includes an embedded ad and it reaches, say, 1 million views, you earn income from generating the traffic. And X is now unmoderated. So you don't have to be one of Elon's rocket scientists to work out what's happening. If you churn out post after post, might be a PhD thesis on quantum mechanics, or it might be an endless flow of pornography or vile racist bile calling for people to burn down a hotel housing asylum seekers. If enough people see it, you make money. Musk bought Twitter and converted it from an interesting, if occasionally a bit nasty, town square into what it is now, an absolute toxic swamp. He paid $44 billion 2 years ago. X is now estimated to be worth less than a quarter of that, $9.5 billion. So why throw away $35 billion? It's hard to get your head around. I've only ever won $35 on Tats Lotto, no billions. Musk is buying power, not a social media platform. His car company, his space rockets, all the other activities do not give him power. And it's global. It transcends the parochial outlook typical of even a major metropolitan newspaper, TV station or radio network. Upon taking control, he simply ignored or scrapped all the rules, done away with the moderators of content and the staff who protected what we loosely call the social licence of a platform. So he's gone for social confusion, not social cohesion. Now, intriguingly, and this is important, there's been an arm wrestle with Elon Musk in Brazil. A Supreme Court judge earlier this year totally banned X in Brazil and ordered phone companies and internet suppliers to block access to it. The dispute started with right-wing anti-government political actors using X to spread disinformation, including calling for violence against the Brazilian government. The Brazilian government then ordered X to remove the offending material, which they refused to do, saying that would be censorship. In protest, and to defy the authorities, X withdrew its representative from Brazil, which contravenes local media laws. There's no one there, there's no one who can be held to account. So the government went to their Supreme Court and obtained orders that X be blocked unless and until Musk agreed to remove the violent material and return a representative to Brazil. Supreme Court Judge Moraes described Musk as an outlaw who would, quote, allow the massive spread of disinformation, hate speech, and attacks on the democratic rule of law, violating the free choice of the electorate by keeping voters away from real and accurate information. In retaliation and escalation, Musk tweeted calls for protest and for the judge to be impeached. He also called for the US government to intervene to confiscate Brazilian state assets and to halt foreign aid. I mention in this context that Musk is heavily promoting the election of Donald Trump and has publicly offered to serve in a Trump cabinet if the opportunity arose. I wonder what he might want to do with that power were it to come his way. But just this week, Musk capitulated and agreed to do all the things ordered by the Brazilian court. And as we speak, X is resuming its presence in Brazil. So social media giants can be reined in. It requires bold and assertive politicians and judges. And closer to home, we've had another tussle with Musk. Australia's e-safety commissioner recently tried to force X to take down child sex abuse material. Musk refused and called the Australian government fascist. Julian Mungrant, our e-safety commissioner, who I might say has an excellent, helpful website, fought on in the courts. She failed to have X forced to remove material, but just last week, our federal court ruled X is obliged to respond to a transparency notice providing information about measures to address the proliferation of child sexual abuse material and exploitation material on its platform. And the Safety Commissioner has separately commenced civil penalty proceedings against X in relation to its non-compliance, alleged, with the transparency notice. Now, X is the standout rogue. Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, they all intervene when an account breaks their admittedly inadequate guidelines, but X does not. Facebook postures as the good kid on the block. Meta, who own Facebook, partner with over 100 fact-checkers in around 60 different languages to bolster their credibility and enhance what they hope is a central role in the future of whatever this tech eventually becomes. Mark Zuckerberg is positioning himself to benefit, with his empire to be the good citizen. So if we're trying to wrestle with these monsters, as happened in Brazil, what works best? Well, government is hard, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So much of this work has already been done. 150 media academics were recently surveyed and asked what should be done about digital misinformation. Now, not surprisingly, the first thing they said is invest more in our work, which is media literacy. But the digital hygiene or digital media literacy is only one part of the solution. Finland, they've taken Russian misinformation so seriously because it's a threat to their very existence. They've created a national literacy training initiative. The Netherlands are using gaming technology and techniques to teach awareness. Estonia, France, Sweden, Norway, Taiwan, the UK, Canada, and Lithuania are all establishing entities that have the job of policing and undoing, when necessary, mis and disinformation. They're relying in part on digital hygiene programs and using tech to educate people about tech traps. Here in Melbourne, we have a colleague of mine at the University of Melbourne who's developed a phone game that overcomes climate scepticism, which the UN paid to have adapted to COVID vaccine resistance in illiterate communities in Africa, to combat it using a phone game. It's brilliant. But annoyingly, the South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas, has a proposal now adopted in principle all across our federation for a social media minimum age. On Instagram, they're called teen accounts. In my view, it's a total waste of time. First of all, banning things never works. It also fails to address the underlying problem and falsely offers reassurance to rattled parents. But most of all, it lets the platforms avoid doing the harder work. And any digital native worth their weight in microchips can get around a ban in less time than it's taken to say that sentence. What we have to do is force the media moguls to share access to their data, because that's what explains the magnitude and complexity of the challenge. But as we need that data, they're doing the opposite. Meta, who own Facebook and others, are winding down a program called CrowdTangle, which is their own platform monitoring tool, which originally was going to be available for everybody to see what was going on behind the curtain. At the same time, the EU's Digital Services Act is trying to force platforms to assist in identifying systemic risk. They want to force the data to be made available. But even under their regime, the platforms will decide what they'll share and who they'll share it with. Fighting social media companies is like wrestling an octopus. They've got the information that you need to fight them. Try getting offending material removed from a social media platform. In the US, that process has become incredibly politicised. Trump supporters are protecting the purveyors of fake news, saying that bringing it down is censorship and in breach of the free speech protections in the US Constitution. The US Supreme Court looked at it just a few months ago, a case called Murphy and Missouri, which began after conservatives sought orders that the Biden administration cannot limit what is said or published on social media at all. The Biden White House during COVID were pressing platforms to remove conspiracy theories and dangerous attacks on, for instance, Dr. Fauci, which were being circulated on social media. The free speech absolutists challenged it. Now, the US Supreme Court has rejected that challenge, but they did it on the grounds of standing. They didn't address the free speech principle. Tellingly, the three conservative Trump-appointed judges described the majority's dismissal of the case as disappointing, missing an opportunity to enshrine the freedom of social media platforms to let anyone say just about anything. And you can bet your bottom dollar the free speech absolutists will try again, and with a test case next time that avoids the stumbling block of problematic standing, so that they get their absolutist position in front of what is an increasingly politicised US Supreme Court. Closer to home, the Albanese government is right now introducing what they hope is progress here. The Communications Legislation Amendment, bracket, Combating Misinformation and Disinformation, close bracket, Bill 2024, empowers the Australian regulator, ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, to be able to compel digital platforms to provide data and to regulate activity that is, quote, reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm. Every lawyer in this room is immediately recognising that every word there will be contested. How do you establish contribute to or reasonably likely, and what's serious harm? What may be met with an indifferent shrug of the shoulder by one person is serious harm to another. How would that have applied in the Voice referendum? Would some of the more preposterous claims about how the Voice was to work be regarded as causing or contributing to serious harm? Well, it would if you're Indigenous, It wouldn't be if you're not, or if you're a white supremacist. Would that be regarded as politically protected free speech? Just today, our Human Rights Commission weighed in with a submission on that legislation calling for stronger protection for free speech. And the Opposition Communications Shadow Minister, David Cowen, has said that they will oppose the bill because, quote, honestly held opinions of Australians can be deemed misinformation under the law. He's plain wrong. The law does not in any way impact on what individual citizens can or can't believe. It's about regulating what's carried online by a digital platform. You can have your beliefs. They can be as out there as you like. But can you project them to the world? So we're introducing an individualised system. We have it already with litigation. If you're defamed, you can ask a social media company to take down the content, like a defamation concerns notice. They can remove the content, or if they don't, you have the right to proceed. Just like an established publisher can't broadcast or print hate speech or racial vilification in the newspaper or on radio or television, it shouldn't be allowed online either. You can't have a world where two standards apply, depending on your method of spewing your hate. It's not okay in the newspaper, it's not okay on the radio, it's not okay on TV, but you can do what you like on X. That's ridiculous. It's worth mentioning we don't actually have free speech in Australia. It's never been free. The myth of free speech needs to be debunked. Speech is limited by hate laws, vilification protection, defamation, contempt, false advertising rules, election advertising rules, and so on. They all exist for when the moral and ethical standards of civil society are being tested. It's imperfect, yes, but governing is the art of do what you can with what you have where you are, said Teddy Roosevelt. I'd like our government to go much further. Either declare social media platforms to be publishers like anyone else, or, equally potent, abolish anonymity online. Neither is likely to happen. Social media sites describe themselves as just the pipeline that carry other people's content. They refuse to be classified as publishers, but I don't think that's accurate. They're more like a library where you can go and look up all types of things, and libraries are held to account for what's inside and responsible for their actions. Anonymity on social media is the major contributor to abuse and hate speech. If you know you're unlikely to ever be held to account for what you say, well, there's no inhibition. When social media was first launched, being able to speak your mind free of being judged or punished or sacked or harassed was more than a novelty. Being able to say things without being held to account presented an opportunity for greater diversity of opinion and more reflection on the news of the day by people who normally didn't have a voice. But since then, the toxicity oozing from anonymity has shown it to be the Achilles heel of social media and a vulnerability for democracy. Now, anonymity isn't new. We've had pseudonyms in literature, music, stage names, anglicised, ethnicised names in the performing arts and elsewhere forever. And abolishing anonymity will be complex. Some fascinating research by my Melbourne Law School colleague Jessica Lake shows that because of stalking and sexual harassment, women value safety online over anonymity, but men the other way around. Women see power exercised against them by men online and want it stopped. Men see power being exercised against them by the government and don't want that to get in their way. Men's privacy priorities focus on controlling and concealing information other people find out about them. Women's privacy centres on protecting themselves from violation and invasion of their autonomy and dignity. So people with power in society see online tools differently to people without power. But until recently, it's only been the powerful who were deciding on the settings. All that has changed because of deep fake pornography. It has instantly shifted the perception of the need for regulation. The pendulum has swung. Youth suicides, the mental health crisis, trolling, flaming, doxing, all now pose a greater harm than the benefits of anonymity. Sexual harassment, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sovereign citizen nonsense, disinformation. We accept that sometimes people want and need anonymity, whistleblowers, people being stalked and so on, but I think we need to find other ways for this relatively smaller number of people to be protected, to protect the rest of us from the wholesale harm caused by anonymity. It's about weighing up the competing rights. There are now businesses that will cleanse your social media history. There are law firms specialising in litigation against social media platforms who have experience in revealing the humans behind a digital ID. You can launch a defamation claim against a bad reviewer of a restaurant, a hotel, or a plastic surgeon. To abolish anonymity, though, we could just adopt a universal digital identity, but it starts to look like the Australia card. We could go through a driver's licence model, but people get fake IDs, even fake passports. We have to find a way to make it as hard as possible, even though it will never be impossible. Maybe we could look at the organ donor system, which is anonymous. IVF identities, now traceable. Or like adoption, you can be introduced through a professional go-between. And if you want to see the evidence of the value of a verified identity on a social media platform, look at LinkedIn. In summary, experts are divided on which way to go. Whichever way we do it, we've got to do it fast, and 75% of something is better than 100% of nothing. Good governance is a slog. Attention to detail, boring committees, turgid reports, impenetrable spreadsheets, hundreds of pages of submissions to wade through, pretending to respect stakeholders who are trying to undermine you, collaborating with your adversaries, forging alliances despite not liking the people you're aligning with. And those are all the people in your own party, not the other ones. Democracy itself is under siege. There's no doubt Russia has embarked on a deliberate strategy of undermining the West. They failed to overwhelm the West's lead economically, technologically, militarily or culturally. So they're using the Achilles heel of our openness to poison the public square. Last month, the US Department of Justice charged 2 employees of the Russian state media outlet RT with conspiracy to commit money laundering and spying. The individuals are alleged to have paid $14.7 million to a US right-wing social media company to create and distribute nearly 2,000 social media videos across TikTok, Instagram, X and YouTube, wholesaling covert pro-Russian messaging on topics like, surprise, surprise, the Ukraine war, immigration and other domestic US policies. Meta, owner of Facebook among others, banned RT and another Russian media organisation, Rossiya Segodanya, across Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp and Threads. Referencing a pattern of deception and covert influence operations, US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken accused RT of being, quote, a de facto extension of Russia's intelligence apparatus with, quote, cyber operational capabilities and connections to Russian intelligence. And RT instantly lost 7 million followers on Facebook and another million on Instagram. So progress can deliver. According to the Gallup poll, in 1958, 4% of Americans, 4% approved of mixed race marriages. It's now well over 90%. Exactly 100 years ago, we in Australia pioneered compulsory voting, which makes us special. Only 19 countries in the world enforce compulsory voting. The UK's still got a House of Lords. And it's local mayors in America who fiddle with the right to vote. So while we're world-class whingers, endlessly finding fault with our system of governance, the truth is it's the envy of most of the globe. Yes, our FOI system is wobbling. Yes, we could have and should have real-time disclosure of political donations. Yes, the new National Anti-Corruption Commission ought to be embracing public hearings, not only doing its job, but being seen to do its job. Yes, we ought to have 4-year fixed terms for federal parliament, not just some states. And yes, we should have term limits. Personally, I'd say 3 terms in parliament, 12 years, then you have to get out. Let someone else have a go, which introduces some urgency to a politician's career. But yes, we could improve many aspects of our democracy, but progress is never linear. It doesn't just happily move along a line of inevitable improvement. It jumps around, it stumbles, it trips. It will only continue if we work at it. And here's the rub. Claire O'Neill, when she was Home Affairs Minister, released a document earlier this year called Strengthening Australian Democracy. I recommend it to you. It says democracy is a national asset. Mis- and disinformation is one of the challenges, as is AI, along with declining public trust, foreign interference and social dynamics of division, whatever that means. The solution is to enhance democratic resilience through civic engagement, democratic experimentation and innovation. We have to boost volunteering. Civic literacy comes from civic participation, when people are invested in the outcomes by being invested, involved, active in their communities. Restoring Are You OK Day, street parties, grassroots sport, getting local government to spend less time worrying about whether the fence conforms with heritage listing and spending money on libraries, choirs, outreach programs, schools as community hubs. In Ireland, they've turned to citizen assemblies. Portugal, Finland and Taiwan are innovating with all sorts of ways to engage with voters, to make them care. Paris City Council has a fabulous initiative. It's called Madame Mayor, I Have an Idea. Anyone can suggest something to the council. 11,000 people have. 450 of those ideas have been implemented. So when making difficult social policy, remember, the loudest voices are not necessarily the best ones. And in an age of grievance, amplified by social media, don't let every idiot be a publisher. I thank you that an audience even turns up to listen to a washed-up ABC radio host on a Thursday evening, when I'm sure you all have better things to do. But I leave you with the words of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Politics ought to be the part-time profession of every citizen who would protect the rights and privileges of free people. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much for that, John. I hope everyone feels like they learn as much as I did. I definitely learned that I made the right choice by not going for the French cars. You and I will probably never agree on that, so I'm really glad to find something else that I've got my rap music, you've got your French cars. But I also thought, talking about Zelman and his character and how that sort of linked from a digital native with the artificial intelligence and the need for the human element, I think some of his characteristics that you mentioned before might suggest what that human element is to balance, I suppose balance the challenges, both the good and the bad of social media. I thought the comment about the passive listeners and the active engagement also points again to the concept of the human element, which can be very slow compared to information online that is quite fast, which requires that ability to think, to measure things before you move on. And and I think fundamentally connects to the most important part of human element, which is trust. And the declining trust in our institutions partly means that people aren't able to rely on them. And that means we build trust by starting local, starting from who we know and what we know and working through it. So those are my learnings. I hope you also drew on yours. And the greatest one that I got was you can buy followers online. I did not know that, and I have taken some thorough notes for my friend. With that, I would like to thank you all again, and thank you very much for coming in and delivering Oration. We've got a very small team at Zelman Cowen, so I wanted to thank them. I am sure I might forget a name. If I do, please pretend that I did remember. But first I want to start with Eva, who works with me. Thank you so much. She sets up this whole event. And then Keishi joined us recently. We're still trying to hold on to her. And much more recently, she doesn't work in our team, but we consider her to still belong there, Carol, who attended today. So thank you so much as well. Oh, yes, and I forgot Seljan, who was giving us all the drinks. And then to all of you wonderful and amazing people, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us. I hope to see you at the next Oration, and please bring someone along when you come. Thank you very much.